Your designs are creative, Amanda, but they lack the sophistication our clients expect, my business partner said, dismissing my portfolio in front of a major development company. The executives nodded thoughtfully. My partner, David Sterling, smiled confidently and opened his own presentation folder. Let me show you what I've been envisioning for the waterfront project. I sat at the conference table in the developer's downtown office, watching David present architectural designs that were unmistakably mine. The spatial concepts were mine. The sustainable design elements were mine. Even the specific material choices and structural innovations came directly from blueprints I'd spent 16 months developing and sharing with him during our partnership meetings. This was the 13th time in 2 years that David had stolen my architectural designs and presented them as his own work to clients, developers, or architectural journals. I'd documented every instance meticulously, gathered irrefutable proof, and planned my response with the precision I brought to structural engineering. Because what neither David nor these developers knew was that I'd already filed copyright protection on all my original designs, secured contracts with 3 major developers who wanted to work directly with me, and been approached by a prestigious architecture firm about a senior partner position. I'd also consulted with attorneys who confirmed that David had no legal rights to designs I'd created independently. In 48 hours, I would dissolve our partnership and reveal that every award-winning project David had been claiming credit for was actually my design work, protected by copyrights and documented creation records. His architecture firm would lose its creative foundation, its major clients, and its industry reputation. Mine would launch with the designs he'd tried to steal, proper attribution, and opportunities he'd blocked through his exploitation. Before we witness how a talented architect whose designs were stolen for years used legal strategy and industry connections to destroy her partner while launching her own successful firm, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes design theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing, and that creative plagiarism should be exposed publicly. If you've had your architectural work stolen, if you've watched partners take credit for your designs, if you've been the invisible creative force behind someone else's firm's success, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic planning overcome exploitation in creative industries. Now let's step into the world of architecture where a brilliant designer's work was systematically stolen by her charismatic business partner, where industry relationships enabled exploitation, and where 2 years of careful preparation created the foundation for complete professional destruction and design triumph. My name is Amanda Chen, and I'm a 34-year-old architect originally from Portland, Oregon. I grew up in a family where both my parents were civil engineers, and I was surrounded by discussions about structures, materials, and the intersection of form and function. Building design felt like my natural language from childhood. I learned to draw architectural plans when I was 10 years old, sitting at my father's drafting table while he worked on residential projects. He taught me about load-bearing walls, about how buildings needed to be both beautiful and structurally sound, about the responsibility architects had to create spaces that improved people's lives. Those lessons shaped everything about how I approach design. I remember one specific evening when I was 11, watching my father work on plans for a custom home in the West Hills neighborhood. He let me sketch a proposed kitchen layout, showing me how to think about work triangles and natural light. When the clients approved a version close to my sketch, my father framed my original drawing and hung it in his office. He told me that good architecture started with understanding how people actually lived in spaces. That philosophy stayed with me through my teenage years. I spent weekends visiting construction sites with my father, watching buildings emerge from blueprints. I learned to read structural drawings before I could drive, understood load calculations before trigonometry made sense in school. By 14, I was helping my father with preliminary designs for small residential additions. My mother contributed a different perspective to my architectural education. As a structural engineer specializing in seismic design, she taught me about the hidden systems that made buildings safe. She'd explain how forces moved through structures, how materials responded to stress, how foundation design determined what was possible above ground. I learned that beautiful architecture required mastering invisible complexities. During high school, I entered a regional design competition for sustainable affordable housing. My proposal combined passive solar design with modular construction techniques, creating units that were both energy efficient and aesthetically appealing. The project won first place, and the recognition reinforced my commitment to architecture that balanced environmental responsibility with visual sophistication. I earned a scholarship to the University of California, Berkeley, studying architecture with a focus on sustainable design and innovative structural systems. College was intellectually thrilling, learning from professors who were pushing boundaries of what architecture could accomplish environmentally and socially. I was particularly interested in how design could address climate change through energy efficiency and sustainable materials. My first-year studio professor, Michael Chong, had worked with renowned sustainable architects and brought that experience to his teaching. He pushed us to question every design decision, to justify aesthetic choices with functional reasoning, to think about buildings as systems rather than just forms. His critiques were demanding but transformative, teaching me to articulate the thinking behind my design work. During sophomore year, I participated in a design-build project creating a community center for a low-income neighborhood in Oakland. The experience taught me about architecture's social dimensions, about working with communities to understand their needs, about the gap between academic design and construction realities. We built the center over 6 months, and seeing people use the space we'd created was profoundly satisfying. I spent junior year studying abroad in Copenhagen, immersing myself in Scandinavian approaches to sustainable design. Danish architecture demonstrated that environmental responsibility didn't require sacrificing beauty or comfort. Buildings could be energy efficient and visually stunning simultaneously. The experience shaped my entire design philosophy. My senior thesis involved designing a net-zero energy residential complex that combined innovative passive cooling systems with beautiful modern aesthetics. The project earned departmental honors and was featured in several architecture publications as an example of how sustainable design didn't require sacrificing visual appeal. The recognition helped me secure a position at a respected San Francisco architecture firm after graduation. I spent 6 years at Morrison & Associates, working my way from junior designer to project architect. The firm specialized in high-end residential and small commercial projects, and the experience taught me about the business of architecture, about client relations, about navigating building codes and construction realities. My first major project at Morrison was a hillside residence in Marin County with complex site challenges. The steep slope required creative structural solutions, and I designed a cantilevered section that seemed to float above the landscape. The project won a regional design award, though the firm's principal architect received credit while my contribution was acknowledged only internally. I worked on numerous projects during those 6 years, contributing design elements that became signature features of Morrison's portfolio. A curved glass facade for a Nob Hill penthouse renovation. An innovative courtyard system for a multi-unit development in Berkeley. A sustainable addition to a historic Victorian that won preservation awards. I was proud of these contributions, though always as part of larger teams where individual authorship wasn't publicly attributed. By my 5th year at Morrison, I'd become project architect on several significant commissions. I led client meetings, coordinated with contractors, managed junior designers. The experience gave me comprehensive understanding of architecture practice beyond pure design. But I felt creatively constrained by working within someone else's design philosophy and firm structure. Morrison & Associates had a distinct aesthetic that all projects needed to reflect, regardless of which architect actually designed them. The firm's founder, Thomas Morrison, reviewed every design and imposed his preferences. I'd spend months developing concepts only to have them modified to match Morrison's established style. The work was high quality but felt artistically restrictive. I wanted to pursue my own vision for sustainable luxury architecture, to create buildings that demonstrated environmental responsibility could coexist with sophisticated design. I wanted my own practice where I could fully express my architectural voice without filtering through someone else's aesthetic preferences. At 30, I decided to start my own architecture firm. I had strong technical skills, a clear design philosophy, and enough industry connections to make independence feasible. What I didn't have was business expertise, established developer relationships, or the marketing capabilities that new architecture firms needed to attract clients. I met David Sterling at an architecture industry conference in San Francisco. He was 37, charismatic and well-connected, with an MBA from Stanford and a decade of experience in real estate development and architectural project management. He approached me after my presentation about sustainable residential design, saying he'd been looking for a talented architect partner to build a firm focused on high-end sustainable projects. We met for coffee the following week at a cafe near Union Square. David talked enthusiastically about his vision for an architecture firm that could compete for luxury residential projects while maintaining environmental principles. He said the market had strong demand for sustainable high-end design, but that most architects either focused on sustainability at the expense of aesthetics or created beautiful buildings without environmental responsibility. David explained his background in development had taught him how wealthy clients thought about architecture projects. He understood their priorities, their concerns, their decision-making processes. He knew how to position architecture services to appeal to high-net-worth individuals willing to pay premium prices for exceptional design. He said this market knowledge combined with my design talent would create something unique. Over several meetings, David outlined how a partnership might work. He'd handle all business development, client acquisition, contract negotiation, and firm operations. I'd focus entirely on design, working with clients on creative vision and managing the technical aspects of projects. The division seemed perfect, allowing me to concentrate on architecture while someone else handled aspects of practice I found less engaging. David had connections to wealthy developers and investors, understood the business side of architecture, and could handle everything from client acquisition to contract negotiation to firm operations. He said my design talent combined with his business expertise would create a formidable partnership. The division of responsibilities seemed ideal. We formed Sterling Chen Architecture as a 50-50 partnership, both our names on the LLC documents. David handled initial business development while I focused on building our design portfolio and capabilities. We secured office space in the financial district with beautiful views that would impress potential clients. The setup felt professional and promising. The office was a corner unit on the 23rd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. David insisted on premium furniture and finishes, saying the space needed to convey success and sophistication to potential clients. We installed large-format monitors for presenting renderings, professional photography of architectural details for the walls, a conference table that could seat 8 people comfortably. David hired a receptionist and administrative assistant, bringing professional polish to the firm's operations. He designed business cards and marketing materials with sleek branding. He set up the LLC structure, opened business accounts, established relationships with insurance providers and accounting services. The operational infrastructure appeared solid and professional. The early months were productive. I developed conceptual designs for several project types we wanted to pursue, creating a portfolio that showcased our firm's aesthetic and sustainable design approach. David would review designs and provide feedback, always enthusiastic about the work I was producing. He'd bring potential clients by the office to see my designs, presenting them as examples of what we could create. I created designs for different residential topologies that demonstrated our capabilities across various scales and contexts. A modern hillside home that integrated seamlessly with natural topography. A multi-unit sustainable development with shared green spaces. A historic renovation incorporating cutting-edge environmental systems. A minimalist beach house maximizing ocean views while minimizing environmental impact. I shared everything with David during this development phase, walking him through my design process, explaining the thinking behind spatial concepts and material choices. I thought we were partners building a firm together, that my openness about creative decisions was normal collaboration between design and business leadership. David would ask thoughtful questions during these reviews, showing genuine interest in understanding the design work. He'd inquire about why I'd chosen specific materials, how I'd approached site analysis, what informed my decisions about proportions and massing. I appreciated his engagement, interpreting it as a business partner learning enough about architecture to effectively represent our firm. The theft started subtly during client presentations. David would describe projects using language that subtly claimed creative credit. He'd say, "We designed," or "our concept," when discussing buildings I'd created entirely on my own. He'd present renderings without clearly stating that I'd created every design element. At first, I told myself this was normal business communication, that David was using inclusive language to present us as a unified firm. But the pattern became troubling when he started taking meetings with major clients without inviting me, returning with signed contracts for projects where clients thought David was the lead designer. The first undeniable instance involved a luxury residential project in Pacific Heights, a prestigious San Francisco neighborhood. I'd developed a comprehensive design that combined sustainable features with sophisticated modern aesthetics tailored to the specific site. The design required months of work, including detailed studies of solar orientation, wind patterns, and integration with the neighborhood's architectural character. The Pacific Heights site was challenging, a narrow lot with strict neighborhood design guidelines and demanding clients who wanted both architectural distinction and environmental performance. I spent weeks analyzing precedents in the neighborhood, understanding the historic context, determining how to create something contemporary that respected the area's character. My design solution featured a 3-story glass and steel facade set back from the street, with the front portion maintaining traditional massing that matched neighboring buildings. The setback created a private courtyard visible through floor-to-ceiling glass, giving the street facade visual interest while the rear of the home opened dramatically toward bay views. I incorporated passive solar design throughout, with carefully calculated overhangs that blocked summer sun while allowing winter solar gain. The mechanical systems used geothermal heat pumps and radiant floor heating, eliminating conventional HVAC equipment. Photovoltaic panels integrated into the roof design provided electricity, and a gray water system recycled water for landscape irrigation. The interior spatial organization created dramatic double-height spaces while maintaining energy efficiency through strategic zoning. Living spaces occupied the sunniest areas, while bedrooms and private spaces were positioned for optimal acoustic separation and privacy. The material palette combined natural woods with steel and glass, creating warmth within a contemporary aesthetic. I presented this design to David with comprehensive drawings, renderings, and technical specifications. He reviewed everything carefully, asked questions about various design decisions, and seemed genuinely impressed with the work. He said the Pacific Heights project would be perfect for establishing our firm's reputation for sophisticated sustainable design. 2 weeks later, David told me he had a meeting scheduled with the Pacific Heights clients to finalize project details. He said it would be just preliminary discussion about timeline and budget, nothing requiring my presence. I thought this was normal business management, leaving administrative conversations to my business partner while I focused on design work. David returned from that meeting with a signed contract and deposit check. He seemed pleased with how the presentation had gone, saying the clients were excited about the project and impressed with the design vision. But as he described the meeting, I realized he'd presented my design work as his own creative vision. During one particularly frustrating client presentation, David used renderings I'd created alongside a presentation that described his design philosophy and his innovative approach to sustainable architecture. Every rendering showed buildings I'd designed, every sustainability feature came from my technical knowledge, every aesthetic decision reflected my vision. But David spoke about it all as if these ideas originated with him. I was sitting in that meeting, watching the client take notes about David's design process and architectural vision. The client asked specific questions about material choices and structural systems. David answered confidently, describing approaches I'd researched and selected as if they were his own discoveries. He was performing expertise he didn't actually possess, using my work to create an illusion of creative leadership. After the meeting, I confronted David more directly about claiming my designs as his creative work. He looked at me with apparent confusion, as if my frustration was incomprehensible. He said that as partners in an architecture firm, all designs were ours, regardless of who physically created them. He said I was being territorial about work that belonged to the partnership we'd built together. The conversation became an argument about ownership, attribution, and what partnership meant in creative professional contexts. David insisted his business development and client relationships were equally valuable to my design work, that the firm's success was collaborative even if I'd physically created all the designs. He said demanding individual credit undermined our partnership and made me seem difficult. I left that conversation feeling manipulated and diminished. David had taken a legitimate complaint about design theft and reframed it as my personal problem with sharing recognition. He'd made me question whether I was being unreasonable to expect acknowledgement for creating every design our firm had produced. That evening, I called a former professor from Berkeley who'd become a mentor, Professor Elizabeth Martinez. I described what was happening with David. She listened carefully, then told me something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. She said she'd seen this pattern before in architecture practices, business partners systematically claiming creative credit from talented designers, keeping them invisible while building reputations on stolen work. Professor Martinez emphasized that architecture, unlike many fields, had strong legal protections for design copyright. She explained that architectural drawings and designs were protected intellectual property, that I could copyright my work independently of the firm, and that documentation of my design process would be crucial if I needed to prove authorship. Most importantly, she said I should immediately start protecting my work legally and documenting that all designs were mine. She recommended consulting with attorneys specializing in intellectual property and architecture, filing copyright registrations on all my designs, and keeping comprehensive records proving my sole creative authorship. Her advice was clear and urgent. Don't confront David again until I had legal protection established. Don't share any new designs without copyright registration. Document everything, especially any communications where David claimed creative credit. And start building relationships with clients and developers independent of Sterling Chen architecture, so I'd have professional options if I needed to leave the partnership. Following Professor Martinez's advice, I began systematically protecting and documenting my work. I filed copyright registrations on every design I'd created for Sterling Chen architecture, submitting my original drawings, concept sketches, and development documentation. The copyright registrations established legal proof that I'd created the designs, providing protection against David's theft. The copyright registration process required comprehensive documentation of my creative process. I submitted early concept sketches showing design development, CAD files with creation metadata proving I'd authored the drawings, handwritten notes about design decisions, and photographs of physical models I'd built. Each registration created legal record establishing me as the design's creator, regardless of the partnership arrangement with David. I also started keeping detailed design journals describing my creative process for every project. I photographed my sketches and working drawings with dates. I saved all digital files with metadata showing creation dates and my authorship. I was building comprehensive evidence that would prove I'd created everything David was claiming as his vision. Every evening after David left the office, I'd spend hours documenting my work. I created backup copies of all design files, storing them on external drives kept at home rather than just on office servers David controlled. I photographed design development work before sharing it with David. I kept detailed logs of which designs I'd created and when, cross-referencing them with dates David had presented them to clients or entered them in competitions. Simultaneously, I began building professional relationships independent of David and Sterling Chen Architecture. I attended industry events alone, joined professional organizations, and made sure people in the San Francisco architecture community knew me as an actual designer rather than just David's business partner. I was establishing my own professional identity. One particularly valuable connection came through a Women in Architecture networking group I joined. Through this group, I met several successful women architects who'd faced similar credit theft earlier in their careers. They shared strategies for protecting work, advice about leaving exploitative partnerships, and encouragement that my concerns about David's behavior were legitimate and serious. One architect, Maria Rodriguez, told me she'd left a partnership 10 years earlier after her partner had systematically claimed credit for her designs. She'd struggled initially after leaving but had built a successful independent practice. She emphasized the importance of having copyrights registered and comprehensive documentation before confronting exploitation or leaving partnerships. Maria's story and advice gave me both validation and strategic direction. I wasn't overreacting to David's behavior. I was recognizing a serious pattern of professional theft that required careful response. The documentation I was gathering wasn't paranoid but necessary protection of my intellectual property and creative work. During this documentation period, I also started having preliminary conversations with developers and clients I'd worked with through Sterling Chen Architecture. I wanted to understand whether they knew I'd created the designs David had been presenting as his work. The conversations were revealing and disturbing. Multiple clients told me they'd assumed David was the lead designer on their projects because of how he'd presented himself in meetings and correspondence. They'd believed they were hiring Sterling Chen Architecture primarily for David's design vision. Several expressed surprise when I explained I'd actually created their projects, saying David had certainly implied the designs were his creative work. One client, a developer named Robert Chen who'd commissioned a sustainable multi-unit project in Berkeley, was particularly frank. He told me he'd worked with Sterling Chen Architecture specifically because he was impressed with David's presentation about innovative sustainable design. He'd assumed the designs David showed were David's own creative work. When I showed him my original sketches and design development documentation proving I'd created everything, he was shocked and visibly angry. Robert said he felt deceived, that he'd signed a contract believing he was getting David's design expertise when in reality David had no design capabilities. He told me explicitly that if I left Sterling Chen Architecture and started my own practice, he'd want to work with me directly on future projects. He said several other developers he knew would likely feel the same way. These conversations confirmed that David's credit theft wasn't just affecting my relationship with him but was damaging my professional reputation in ways that would impact my career long-term. Developers thought he was the creative talent behind our firm when in reality he couldn't design a building if his career depended on it. I also discovered that David had been entering my designs in architecture competitions and awards under his name as lead designer, with me listed only as project architect. 3 designs I'd created had won regional awards, and all 3 award announcements credited David Sterling as the principal designer. My name appeared in fine print as a team member. The first award was for the Pacific Heights residence, which won an AIA Northern California Merit Award for Sustainable Residential Design. The award certificate listed David Sterling as principal designer and Amanda Chen as project architect. The award announcement in architecture publications credited David's innovative approach to integrating sustainability with luxury residential architecture. The second award was for a Sausalito hillside home I'd designed with dramatic cantilevers and panoramic bay views. The project won a Regional Design Excellence Award, again with David listed as principal designer. Architecture magazines ran features about the project describing David's design philosophy and creative vision, with my contributions minimized to technical support. The third award was for a multi-unit sustainable development in Oakland that I designed with shared courtyard spaces and passive solar orientation. The project won awards for both design excellence and environmental performance. Every award credited David as the creative force behind the project, while I was mentioned only as supporting team member. The award credits were particularly galling because architecture awards significantly influence professional reputation and career advancement. David was building an award-winning portfolio based entirely on my designs while keeping my contributions minimally acknowledged. The stolen credit would affect future opportunities, speaking invitations, and professional recognition. I started reaching out to the developers and clients who'd commissioned my designs, explaining that I'd created the work they'd hired Sterling Chen Architecture to produce. I asked if they'd be interested in working with me directly if I left the partnership and started my own practice. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Multiple developers said they'd absolutely work with me independently, that they'd been impressed with the designs and would follow the actual designer rather than the business partner. One major developer told me explicitly that he'd only worked with Sterling Chen Architecture because of my design capabilities, that David's contribution seemed primarily administrative. I also received an unexpected call from Catherine Wilson, a partner at Wilson & Associates, one of San Francisco's most prestigious architecture firms. Catherine had seen my work at various industry events and been impressed with the designs attributed to Sterling Chen Architecture. She'd done some research and discovered that I'd actually created those designs, and she wanted to discuss potential opportunities. Catherine's initial email was carefully worded, suggesting she understood the sensitive dynamics at Sterling Chen Architecture. She mentioned seeing my presentation at an AIA conference, being impressed with the sustainable design concepts, and wondering if I might be interested in discussing career opportunities. The phrasing indicated she knew more about my situation than she was stating explicitly. We met for coffee at a cafe in the Mission on a Saturday morning, neutral territory away from Sterling Chen's financial district orbit. Catherine was in her mid-40s, elegant and direct, with 2 decades of experience at one of the Bay Area's most respected firms. She'd built Wilson & Associates' residential practice and was expanding into sustainable luxury design. Catherine began the conversation by acknowledging she'd been hearing my name increasingly in architecture circles, usually in contexts suggesting I was the actual creative force behind Sterling Chen's award-winning work. She said several colleagues had mentioned seeing me at industry events and being struck by the disconnect between my evident design expertise and the minimal credit I received in Sterling Chen publications. She'd done her research carefully before reaching out. She'd reviewed architectural publications featuring Sterling Chen projects, noting that detailed technical questions were consistently answered by me while David handled only high-level business discussion. She'd talked to developers who'd mentioned the designs were actually created by the quiet partner at Sterling Chen. She'd observed that award-winning projects coincided with my arrival at the firm. Catherine told me directly that she believed I was being systematically denied proper credit for my work, that this was unfortunately common in architecture partnerships, and that Wilson & Associates would be interested in offering me a position if I was considering leaving Sterling Chen. She emphasized they valued proper attribution, that designers at Wilson & Associates received appropriate credit for their creative contributions. The offer Catherine eventually made was compelling and carefully structured. I'd join Wilson & Associates as a senior associate with clear path to partnership within 3 years, leading their new sustainable design initiative. I'd have significant creative autonomy over projects in this practice area, proper attribution in all publications and presentations, and compensation that reflected my actual contributions rather than being split with a business partner who contributed nothing to design. The financial package was substantially better than what I was earning at Sterling Chen even with 50% partnership equity. Wilson & Associates could offer sophisticated benefits, professional development resources, and financial stability that a 2-person partnership couldn't match. There would be administrative support, established client relationships, and marketing infrastructure that would allow me to focus primarily on design. Catherine also addressed the professional recognition aspect directly. She said Wilson and Associates actively promoted their designers' work, submitting projects to competitions and publications with proper attribution. They had established relationships with architecture media and understood that individual designer recognition benefited the firm by attracting talent and clients. My work would be credited appropriately. The offer included some unusual provisions that Catherine said they'd developed specifically in response to my situation. There would be written guarantees about attribution in employment contract. I'd retain certain intellectual property rights to designs I created. There would be explicit protections against future credit theft within the firm structure. I was genuinely tempted by Wilson and Associates' offer. Joining an established prestigious firm would provide immediate financial security, professional infrastructure, and institutional credibility. I wouldn't have to manage business operations, worry about acquiring clients, or handle administrative tasks. I could focus almost entirely on architecture and design work I loved. But more tempting than joining another firm was the possibility of finally starting my own independent practice with the client relationships and documentation I'd been building. Several developers had committed to working with me directly. I had copyrights on all my designs. I had comprehensive evidence of David's fraud. The foundation for independence was stronger than I'd initially realized. I told Catherine the first needed time to consider the offer carefully. She was understanding, saying the opportunity would remain available when I was ready to make a decision. She also said something that crystallized my thinking about whether to join Wilson and Associates or start independently. She told me that in her experience, architects who'd had their work stolen often needed to establish their own practices to fully reclaim their professional identities and creative autonomy. That observation was profound and true. What I needed wasn't just fair treatment and proper attribution within someone else's firm structure. I needed to build something entirely my own, where every design decision reflected my creative vision, where every award carried my name alone, where my professional identity wasn't mediated through any partnership or firm hierarchy. I needed to prove to myself and the architecture community that I could succeed independently. I consulted with Sarah Thompson, an attorney specializing in architecture partnerships and intellectual property. Sarah reviewed all my documentation, including copyright registrations, design development records, and evidence of David's credit theft. She confirmed that I had strong legal grounds to dissolve the partnership and establish that David had no rights to designs I'd created. Sarah explained that the partnership agreement David and I had signed didn't transfer copyright ownership of designs to the partnership entity. Under copyright law, one retained ownership of architectural works I'd created unless I'd explicitly transferred those rights, which I hadn't. David had no legal claim to my designs despite our business partnership. Sarah also pointed out that David's behavior potentially constituted fraud, misrepresenting his role in creating designs when presenting to clients or entering competitions. If I wanted to pursue legal action beyond simply dissolving the partnership, I had grounds for claims related to his misrepresentation and damage to my professional reputation. The documentation I'd gathered was comprehensive enough that Sarah felt confident I could dissolve the partnership cleanly, retain rights to all my designs, and establish my own practice without legal complications. She recommended giving formal notice to David, clearly stating that I was leaving the partnership and retaining all copyrights to designs I'd created. During the 18 months I spent documenting David's theft and building my exit strategy, the exploitation continued and escalated. David became increasingly brazen about claiming credit, seemingly confident that I wouldn't challenge him. Each instance of theft added to the evidence I was gathering while strengthening my resolve to leave. One particularly egregious example involved a commission for a private art gallery in Napa Valley. The clients were wealthy art collectors who wanted a building that would showcase their collection while serving as an architectural statement itself. I designed a stunning structure with controlled natural lighting, flexible exhibition spaces, and sustainable climate control systems that protected artwork while minimizing energy use. The design featured a series of interconnected pavilions organized around a central courtyard, with each pavilion scaled to display different types of art. The roof system incorporated sophisticated daylighting strategies, using clerestory windows and light wells to provide natural illumination without direct sunlight that could damage paintings. The structural system used exposed glulam beams that became architectural features themselves. I spent 4 months developing this design, researching museum lighting standards, consulting with art conservation specialists, and creating a building that balanced functional requirements with architectural beauty. The result was one of my best projects, demonstrating how architecture could serve specific programmatic needs while creating memorable spatial experiences. David presented this design to the clients as his creative vision. He gave a lengthy presentation describing his design philosophy for art galleries, his approach to integrating architecture with art display, his innovative thinking about sustainable museum environments. Every concept he described came from my research and design work, but he presented it all as if these ideas originated with him. The clients were impressed and signed a significant contract based on David's presentation. They sent thank you notes addressed to David, praising his creative vision and design sensitivity. They had no idea I'd created everything David had shown them. David forwarded me the thank you notes with a message saying the project was a great win for our firm. Another major theft involved a sustainable winery design in Sonoma County. The clients wanted a production facility that showcased their commitment to environmental stewardship while creating a destination for wine tourism. I designed a building integrated into the hillside, with earth-sheltered production areas that maintained stable temperatures naturally and a tasting room with dramatic views across the vineyards. The design incorporated numerous sustainable features specifically researched for winery applications. Gravity flow production that eliminated energy-intensive pumping, natural ventilation systems that reduced cooling loads, photovoltaic panels integrated into shade structures over parking areas, rainwater harvesting for landscape irrigation, materials sourced locally and selected for low environmental impact. I created detailed renderings showing how the building would emerge from the landscape, how visitors would experience the arrival sequence, how the tasting room's floor-to-ceiling glass would frame vineyard views. The presentation materials included technical documentation of all sustainable systems and their expected performance. The complete package represented months of specialized research and design development. David presented this project at a sustainable architecture conference in Los Angeles, giving a keynote presentation about innovative winery design. He showed my renderings, described my sustainable systems, and explained my design concepts as if they were his own work. The presentation was recorded and posted online, creating permanent documentation of David claiming my creative work as his own. Conference attendees approached me afterward with questions, assuming I'd worked on David's project in some supporting role. When they asked technical questions about the sustainable systems, I found myself in the awkward position of explaining designs I'd created while David received credit. The experience was professionally humiliating and clarifying. David wasn't going to stop stealing my work. I needed to leave. I also discovered David had been negotiating with architecture publications to feature Sterling Chen Architecture's work, positioning himself as the firm's creative director and design principal. 2 major architecture magazines ran feature articles about our projects, with David photographed in the office and quoted extensively about design philosophy and creative process. The magazine articles described David's innovative approach to sustainable luxury and his sensitivity to site and context. They showed photographs of him reviewing drawings at his desk, gesturing toward renderings during presentations, standing at construction sites. The articles created comprehensive narrative of David as an accomplished designer, with my role minimized to technical support. One article in Architectural Record particularly stung. The feature showed 6 of my projects with lengthy descriptions of David Sterling's design vision. The writer had interviewed David extensively about his creative process, his inspirations, his approach to architecture. David had described design decisions I'd made, explaining my reasoning as if it were his own thinking. I'd been interviewed briefly for the article as project architect, asked only technical questions about construction details and material specifications. My quotes appeared in sidebars as supporting content, while David's quotes formed the main narrative. The article cemented David's reputation as an innovative designer while keeping me invisible. But every article, every award, every instance of credit theft also created more evidence. I saved all the publications showing David claiming credit for my work. I cross-referenced them with my copyright registrations and design development documentation proving I'd created everything. I was building an airtight case that would expose David's fraud completely. Throughout this period, I maintained careful records of all communications with David. I saved emails where he presented my work to clients without attribution. I documented meetings where he described my designs as his creative vision. I kept copies of contracts listing him as principal designer on projects I'd created. Every piece of evidence strengthened the case I was building. I also documented the emotional and professional toll David's exploitation was taking. I kept a private journal describing how it felt to watch someone steal credit for years of creative work, how frustrating it was to remain invisible while my designs won awards and recognition for someone else. This documentation wasn't just for potential legal purposes but also to remind myself that leaving was necessary and justified. The psychological impact of watching David steal credit was profound and cumulative. Each instance of theft felt like a small violation, but the pattern over 2 years created sustained damage to my professional confidence and sense of identity. I'd wake up at night replaying conversations where David had presented my ideas as his own, feeling angry and helpless simultaneously. There were moments when I questioned my own memory and perception. David's gaslighting was sophisticated enough that I sometimes wondered if I was overreacting to normal partnership dynamics. Maybe claiming "we designed" was just business communication. Maybe my desire for individual recognition was unreasonable in a partnership context. Maybe I was being territorial about collaborative work. But then I'd look at my design journals, my original sketches, my comprehensive documentation of creative process, and the reality would reassert itself. I had created every design Sterling Chen Architecture had produced. David had contributed nothing to the creative work. His theft wasn't ambiguous business partnership dynamics but deliberate fraud. The emotional complexity extended to feelings about the work itself. I'd created designs I was proud of, buildings that represented my best creative thinking and technical capabilities. But seeing those designs attributed to David contaminated the satisfaction I should have felt. Every award announcement crediting David Sterling felt like erasure of my creative identity. I also struggled with anger at myself for not recognizing David's intentions earlier. Looking back, there had been warning signs during our initial partnership discussions. David's vague descriptions of his role in previous architecture projects. His reluctance to show his own design work. His immediate enthusiasm for my portfolio without sharing comparable work of his own. But I'd been excited about starting my own practice, optimistic about partnership possibilities, and perhaps naive about how someone might exploit creative collaboration. I'd trusted David's stated intentions rather than carefully evaluating his actual capabilities and character. That trust had cost me 2 years of proper attribution and professional recognition. The documentation period also strained other relationships in my life. I was working long hours at the office creating designs while also spending evenings and weekends documenting David's theft, consulting with attorneys, and building exit strategy. Friends noticed I seemed stressed and withdrawn. My parents worried I was working too much without explaining why. I couldn't fully explain the situation because I needed to maintain absolute secrecy about my exit plans. If David suspected I was preparing to leave, he might take preemptive action to protect himself or damage my prospects. The need for secrecy meant enduring the exploitation silently while methodically building my case, which was emotionally exhausting. There were multiple times during those 18 months when I wanted to confront David immediately, to expose his fraud publicly without waiting for perfect documentation and strategic preparation. The impulse to confront exploitation directly was strong, but I forced myself to remain patient and systematic. Premature confrontation would give David opportunity to create counter-narratives or protect himself legally. Professor Martinez's guidance was crucial during this period. She'd check in regularly, encouraging me to stay focused on documentation and exit preparation rather than emotional reactions to David's ongoing theft. She reminded me that the goal wasn't just leaving the partnership but establishing independent practice successfully, which required careful planning. The women architects I'd met through professional networks also provided essential support. They understood the specific dynamics of design theft in ways that friends outside architecture couldn't fully grasp. They validated that my response was appropriate and necessary, that David's behavior justified the extensive preparation I was undertaking. Maria Rodriguez particularly helped me maintain perspective during difficult moments. She'd text me encouragement when I felt overwhelmed, remind me that I was building foundation for long-term success, and assure me that the careful preparation would be worth the temporary frustration. Her own experience leaving an exploitative partnership 10 years earlier gave her insights that were invaluable. The documentation period also revealed patterns in how David operated. He was careful never to explicitly state in writing that he'd created specific designs. Instead, he used ambiguous language that implied creative authorship while maintaining plausible deniability. He'd write, "our design," or Sterling Chen Architecture's approach, rather than, "my design," or "I created." This strategic ambiguity made David's theft harder to prove through direct statements but didn't diminish the pattern. When David presented to clients, spoke at conferences, or gave interviews to publications, he consistently positioned himself as the creative force behind designs I'd created. The cumulative effect was clear fraud even if individual statements maintained deniability. After 18 months of careful preparation, I had everything I needed to leave the partnership and expose David's theft. I had copyright registrations on all my designs. I had comprehensive documentation of my creative process. I had commitments from multiple developers to work with me independently. I had legal advice confirming my rights. I had job offers providing backup options. Most importantly, I had absolute certainty that leaving was the right decision. I scheduled a meeting with David at our office on a Friday afternoon. I'd prepared everything carefully, consulting with Sarah Thompson about exactly how to handle the dissolution conversation. I had formal written notice of partnership dissolution. I had documentation proving my copyright ownership of all designs. I had copies of evidence showing his systematic credit theft. David seemed relaxed when I arrived at the conference room, probably assuming this was a routine business meeting. He had his laptop open, showing a presentation he'd prepared for a potential client meeting the following week. The presentation, predictably, featured my designs presented as his creative work. I noticed he was using the Sonoma Winery project renderings I'd created 6 months earlier, describing them in his notes as examples of his sustainable design philosophy. I sat down across from him and placed a folder on the table. The folder contained copies of copyright registrations for every design Sterling Chen Architecture had created, all registered in my name with comprehensive documentation proving my authorship. It contained evidence of 13 instances where David had presented my work as his own to clients, publications, or competitions. It contained letters from developers confirming they'd work with me independently. I began speaking before David could start his typical client meeting routine. I told him I was dissolving our partnership effective immediately. The words came out more calmly than I'd expected, given how much emotion was behind them. David's expression shifted from casual friendliness to confusion, then concern as he began processing what I'd said. "What are you talking about?" David asked, closing his laptop. "Dissolve the partnership? Amanda, if you're frustrated about something, we can discuss it like we always do. We've built something significant here together." I explained that I owned copyrights to every design Sterling Chen Architecture had produced because I'd created them independently and never transferred ownership. I told him I'd documented his systematic misrepresentation of authorship and had legal counsel confirming his behavior constituted fraud. I pushed the folder across the table toward him. David opened the folder and began leafing through the contents. I watched his expression shift as he saw page after page of copyright registrations, all in my name, all dated over the past 18 months. He saw the documentation of instances where he'd claimed my work as his own, each with dates, sources, and evidence. He saw the letters from developers stating they'd work with me directly. "This is ridiculous," David said, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. "These are partnership designs. Everything we've created has been collaborative, part of building this firm together. You can't just claim ownership of work that belongs to Sterling Chen Architecture." I told him that copyright law didn't work that way. I'd consulted with attorneys specializing in architectural intellectual property. Unless I'd explicitly transferred copyright ownership to the partnership entity, which I hadn't, I retained rights to creative works I'd produced. David had no legal claim to designs I'd created, regardless of our business partnership structure. "I've contributed to these projects," David insisted, his tone becoming defensive. "I've brought in the clients, managed the business side, made this firm possible. You're acting like I've done nothing, when in reality my business development has been essential to our success." I acknowledged that David had handled business operations, but pointed out that business development didn't entitle him to claim creative credit for work he hadn't created. His contribution was management, not design. He'd systematically misrepresented himself as the creative force behind projects I'd designed entirely on my own, which constituted fraud. David tried different approaches as the reality of the situation became clearer. He suggested we could restructure the partnership to give me more recognition. He proposed changing how we attributed work in presentations. He offered to revise our partnership agreement to clarify design ownership. Each suggestion was a desperate attempt to prevent the dissolution he could see coming. I told him it was too late for restructuring or compromise. I'd spent 18 months documenting his theft and building exit strategy because I'd lost all trust in the partnership. I explained that I'd already secured commitments from multiple developers to work with me independently, that I had legal protection for all my designs, and that I was launching my own practice regardless of what he proposed. "You're destroying everything we've built," David said, and for the first time I heard genuine emotion in his voice rather than business negotiation tactics. "Sterling Chen Architecture has reputation, client relationships, ongoing projects. You can't just walk away and take everything with you. What am I supposed to do?" I told him that Sterling Chen Architecture's reputation was built entirely on designs I'd created, that the client relationships existed because of my work, and that ongoing projects were mine by copyright law. I explained that he'd have to figure out what to do without the creative capabilities he'd been fraudulently claiming as his own for 2 years. David's response shifted to anger. He accused me of being ungrateful, of forgetting that he'd given me the opportunity to build a practice, of being vindictive and destructive. He said I was throwing away a successful partnership over ego and desire for individual recognition. His words were designed to make me feel guilty, to reframe legitimate complaints about design theft as my personal character flaws. I remained calm, though I could feel anger rising. I told David that he hadn't given me an opportunity but had exploited my creative work while keeping me invisible. I pointed out that every award, every publication feature, every recognition Sterling Chen Architecture had received was based on my designs, which he'd systematically claimed as his own creative vision. "I thought we were partners," David said, his tone shifting to something that sounded like hurt. "I thought we were building something together. This feels like a betrayal of everything we've worked toward." I told him the betrayal had been his systematic theft of credit for my creative work. I explained that every time he'd presented my designs as his own vision, every time he'd accepted awards for work I'd created, every time he'd given interviews describing design philosophy that came entirely from my research and thinking, he'd betrayed the partnership he claimed to value. David tried one final approach, suggesting that public dissolution would damage both our reputations, that we should handle this quietly to protect the firm's image. He proposed that I could leave the partnership amicably, and we'd maintain the fiction of collaborative work rather than exposing his fraud. I handed David formal written notice of partnership dissolution, drafted by Sarah Thompson. The notice specified that I was withdrawing from Sterling Chen Architecture effective immediately, retaining all copyrights to designs I'd created, and establishing my own independent practice. The notice also warned that any attempt to use my designs after dissolution would result in copyright infringement claims and potential fraud lawsuits. I told David the first had no interest in protecting his reputation by maintaining fictions about collaborative work. I explained that I'd be contacting all clients, developers, and architecture publications to clarify that I'd created the designs previously attributed to Sterling Chen Architecture or to him personally. His fraud would be exposed completely, and he'd face consequences for systematic design theft. David sat reading the notice, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He looked at the documentation I'd compiled, seeing comprehensive evidence of his fraud laid out clearly. He realized that I'd been planning this carefully for over a year, that I had legal protection, client relationships, and evidence that would expose him completely if he tried to fight. "You've really thought this through," David said quietly, and I heard resignation in his voice. "You've been planning this for months while working alongside me every day, documenting everything, building your case. I never saw it coming." I told him I'd had no choice but to plan carefully because his theft had been systematic and because I needed to ensure I could leave cleanly with my work protected. I explained that invisible documentation and strategic preparation were the only ways to overcome the power imbalance in our partnership, where he controlled client relationships and firm operations while I created all the actual work. The meeting ended with David understanding he had no options. He couldn't continue using my designs because I owned the copyrights. He couldn't claim the designs were partnership property because copyright law didn't support that position. He couldn't maintain Sterling Chen Architecture's reputation because all its award-winning work was mine and would be leaving with me. His firm would collapse, and his fraud would be exposed. He was finished. I walked out of that office for the last time feeling both relief and vindication. The invisible architect was stepping into visibility. The stolen designs would be properly attributed. The exploiter would face consequences. And I was launching my own practice with the portfolio, client relationships, and legal protection I'd spent 18 months building. Within 2 weeks, I established Chen Design Studio with office space in the Mission District. The space was smaller than Sterling Chen's financial district office but felt authentic and mine. I hung renderings of my projects on the walls with proper attribution. I met with developers who'd committed to working with me directly. I finalized contracts for 3 major projects that would launch my independent practice. The developers I'd been cultivating relationships with during my documentation period immediately transferred their business from Sterling Chen Architecture to Chen Design Studio. Robert Chen, the Berkeley developer, signed a contract for a sustainable multi-unit project within days of my departure. The Napa Art Gallery clients, once I explained that I'd actually created their gallery design, moved their project to my new firm. Within a month of leaving Sterling Chen, I'd secured enough commissions to make my independent practice financially viable. The clients who'd thought they were hiring David's design expertise realized they'd actually been getting mine, and they followed the actual designer rather than the business partner who'd misrepresented his role. I also contacted all the architecture publications that had featured Sterling Chen Architecture's work. I provided them with copyright documentation proving I'd created the designs attributed to David Sterling. I explained that David had systematically misrepresented his role in creating projects, that he'd committed fraud by claiming credit for work he hadn't produced. Several publications ran correction articles or updates acknowledging that Amanda Chen, not David Sterling, had created the designs previously attributed to Sterling Chen Architecture. Architectural Record published a substantial correction explaining that their earlier feature article had misattributed creative credit, and they ran a new feature about my independent practice with accurate attribution. The architecture community response to my story was powerful and validating. Multiple architects, particularly women, reached out saying they'd experienced similar credit theft in partnerships or firm settings. Professional organizations invited me to speak about protecting design copyright and preventing exploitation. The story resonated because design theft was more common than most people acknowledged. David Sterling's reputation collapsed completely. Once developers and clients learned he'd been fraudulently claiming credit for my designs, his credibility was destroyed. Sterling Chen Architecture lost every major client within 2 months. The developers who'd thought they were hiring David's design capabilities pulled their projects. The referrals David had counted on disappeared. Several clients threatened legal action against David for misrepresentation, claiming they'd signed contracts based on false premises about his design capabilities. At least 2 clients pursued arbitration seeking to recover payments they'd made to Sterling Chen Architecture, arguing the contracts were fraudulent because David had misrepresented his role. David attempted to salvage his practice by hiring other designers, but his reputation was so damaged that talented architects refused to work with him. The architecture community understood he'd built his entire reputation on stolen work, and no designer wanted to associate with someone who'd so thoroughly betrayed professional ethics. Within 6 months of my departure, Sterling Chen Architecture closed completely. David dissolved the LLC, unable to maintain the business without any design capabilities or client relationships. The office space was vacated, the website went dark, and David Sterling disappeared from San Francisco's architecture community. I heard through professional networks that David had left architecture entirely, moving to another city and changing careers. His attempt to build reputation and success by stealing my creative work had backfired completely, destroying the career he'd tried to create fraudulently. Meanwhile, Chen Design Studio flourished. My first year of independent practice exceeded every expectation. I completed 5 major residential projects, won 3 design awards properly attributed to me, and was invited to lecture at UC Berkeley's architecture school. The professional recognition I'd been denied while David stole credit for my work came flooding in once I had proper attribution. The Pacific Heights residence I'd designed, which David had previously claimed as his work, was completed and photographed for multiple architecture publications. This time the articles credited Amanda Chen as designer, describing my sustainable design approach and creative vision. The project won an AIA National Honor Award, with my name on the certificate and in all award announcements. The Napa Art Gallery opened to critical acclaim, featured in Art in America and Architectural Digest. The reviews praised the building's sophisticated daylighting, its elegant spatial proportions, and how architecture enhanced rather than competed with the artwork displayed. Every article credited my design, establishing my reputation for culturally sophisticated sustainable architecture. Within 2 years of leaving Sterling Chen Design Studio had completed over a dozen major projects and won 8 design awards. My work was featured regularly in architecture publications, always with proper attribution. I'd established reputation as one of the Bay Area's most innovative sustainable designers, recognition that reflected my actual contributions rather than being stolen by a fraudulent business partner. The financial success matched the professional recognition. Independent practice was more profitable than partnership with David had been, because I wasn't splitting revenue with someone who contributed nothing to the firm's design capabilities. My overhead was lower, my margins were better, and every dollar earned reflected my actual work. I also began advocacy work helping other architects protect their designs and avoid exploitation I'd experienced. I developed resources about copyright registration for architectural work, wrote articles about preventing design theft in partnerships, and mentored young architects about protecting their creative contributions. The American Institute of Architects invited me to speak at their national convention about design copyright and proper attribution. My presentation drew one of the largest audiences at the conference, indicating how many architects had experienced or worried about credit theft. Multiple attendees approached me afterward saying my story had encouraged them to protect their own work or leave exploitative situations. I also worked with Professor Martinez at UC Berkeley to develop curriculum about intellectual property protection for architecture students. We created a course covering copyright law, portfolio documentation, partnership agreements, and strategies for ensuring proper attribution. The course became required for all architecture students, teaching future architects to protect their work from the beginning of their careers. 5 years after leaving Sterling Chen, I'm 39 and running one of the Bay Area's most successful boutique architecture firms. Chen Design Studio has completed over 30 major residential projects, won 8 design awards, and established reputation for sophisticated sustainable architecture properly attributed to actual designer. The professional success vindicated my decision to leave David's exploitation. Every award with my name, every publication crediting my designs, every client hiring me for my creative capabilities represented visibility David tried to deny me. My advocacy work extended beyond personal success to helping other architects facing credit theft. I developed resources about copyright protection, spoke at architecture schools about attribution issues, and mentored young designers about protecting creative work in partnerships. I provided free consultations to architects discovering their partners were stealing credit, helping them document their work and exit exploitative situations. The cumulative impact transformed my individual experience into broader change, making architecture slightly better for designers vulnerable to exploitation. David's credit theft, which was meant to suppress my success, instead catalyzed achievements and advocacy exceeding what either of us imagined. One young architect I mentored, Jessica Park, had been working at a firm where the principal architect was systematically claiming credit for her designs. Using strategies I'd shared about copyright protection and documentation, Jessica gathered evidence of the theft, registered copyrights on her work, and left to establish her own practice. She's now running a successful firm with proper attribution for her creative work. Another architect, Marcus Thompson, contacted me after discovering his business partner had been entering Marcus's designs in competitions under the partner's name. I helped Marcus understand his copyright protections, connect with intellectual property attorneys, and document the theft. Marcus dissolved the partnership and launched an independent practice that's thriving with proper recognition for his design capabilities. These success stories multiplied as more architects learned about protecting their work and refusing to accept invisible exploitation. Each person who left an exploitative situation and succeeded independently strengthened the message that design theft deserved serious consequences and that talented architects could thrive with proper attribution. 7 years after dissolution, Sterling Chen was completely forgotten except as cautionary tale in architecture circles. David had faded into complete obscurity, his attempt to build a career on stolen work having destroyed any credibility he might have had. And I was thriving with proper recognition, using my platform to continue fighting for designers' rights and proper attribution. 10 years after leaving, I published a book combining architectural theory with practical advice about protecting design intellectual property. The book became standard text in architecture schools, widely adopted for professional practice courses. It covered copyright law, documentation strategies, partnership agreements, and real-world examples of design theft and protection. David's fraud became a teaching case in the book, his exploitation immortalized as a cautionary tale educating future generations about protecting creative work. He had wanted to be remembered as a successful architect. Instead, he became an example of what not to do, the partner whose credit theft destroyed his career while elevating his victim to greater success. My daughters are growing up seeing their mother as a successful architect, author, and advocate using her platform to help others. The lessons from my experience with David are applicable beyond architecture to any situation where someone tries claiming credit for others' creative work. 15 years after Sterling Chen dissolution, I received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Institute of Architects recognizing both design excellence and advocacy for proper attribution in architecture profession. The award ceremony included a retrospective of my career emphasizing how I'd transformed personal experience of credit theft into broader movement for designers' rights. The recognition validated that my response to David's exploitation had created positive outcomes beyond personal vindication. His theft catalyzed advocacy, helping hundreds of architects protect their work and achieve proper recognition. The Invisible Architect became a celebrated designer and advocate. The stolen designs were properly attributed and award-winning. The exploiter left architecture discredited. And the profession became measurably more aware that design theft deserved serious consequences. That's the ultimate outcome when exploitation meets someone talented enough to succeed independently, strategic enough to document and plan carefully, and committed enough to transform personal justice into advocacy benefiting others. Stolen credit was restored, fraud was exposed, the exploiter was destroyed, and architecture became measurably better because one person refused to accept invisible exploitation.